mistaken, or does the Sermon on the Mount contain the statement, "Blessed are the geek"? Oh no, that's meek. Sorry about that. Yeah, well, maybe there's some manuscript somewhere that does. I don't know. Be nice. Next time I do a New Testament paraphrase, I may plug that in. Speaking of which, I hope it'll be fairly soon that my book, The Heresy of Paraphrase, comes out, because it'll have the four gospels with a twist, with a spin, um, something like the old Aramaic targums, where they not only translate the old texts, but kind of interpret them and pack that in. And that's what I've done. You're going to get a kick out of it, I'm sure. I'll let you know when it's closer. Okay, so this is a special one. Bishop Taylor's told me about some chit chat on the old airwaves over whether Jesus and Simon Magus might have been the same person. I admit I have occasionally speculated that the business with Simon Magus rescuing Helena from a brothel, because she was actually the incarnate Ennoia or Epinoia, the first thought of the creator. And then she henceforth travels with him as his consort and so on, no doubt, raising eyebrows everywhere. It is kind of parallel to the standard story of Jesus reforming Mary Magdalene as a prostitute and making her into a disciple. But that's not as popular as it might have been once, because feminist exegesis says, wait a minute, you don't know that Mary Magdalene was supposed to be a prostitute, which is kind of odd to object to, since feminists tend to think that prostitutes or sex workers are fine. I mean, I got nothing against them. But nonetheless, they think that it's invidious and insulting and demeaning to say that she was a whore. And they could be right. I mean, I wouldn't be surprised if that was polemical insults. Yeah, come on, look at her background, look at her resume. Could be. In the same way, the idea that she was possessed of 7 demons always kind of makes me wonder, how did they count them? How did they know? But at any rate, that kind of reminds me of one of the pastoral epistles. It says, don't listen to those doctrines of demons. So, yeah, I did an article once called Mary Magdalene, Gnostic Apostle, where I suggested that, yeah, the idea that she was a prostitute might be like Jezebel, so-called, in the book of Revelation, that teaches her disciples to fornicate, etc. Just a slur. And the demon possession charge that she was teaching doctrines inspired by demons, in the opinion of the Catholic Church. So they said, oh, she's demon possessed. And then you get all kinds of visions of Bob Larson haranguing people, bad actors pretending to be demon possessed. But there are parallels between them, so something may be going on there. It's hard to say, because, like, we know that there are motifs attached here to Jesus and there to Simon. But does that mean they were the same guy? I mean, some of this stuff is so wacky, it has to be legendary, and it's hard to imagine what historical original they may have come from. Like in one of the stories where there's a miracle contest between Simon Peter and Simon Magus. They're both flying in the air, and somehow Peter causes Simon to crash. Well, there's another story in the Toledo of Yeshu where Jesus and Judas are flying around, and Judas somehow causes Jesus, who's a false prophet in this one, a Jewish non-Christian text, and he crashes to the ground. There's later a Dr. Faustus episode that's based on the same thing. So you don't really know if you can identify the characters in a legendary story as if they're both based on historical individuals and the same story is told about both because they weren't both. There's just one of them. So parallels don't necessarily mean you can identify the main character. But there is something very interesting in the Simon Magus lore, and that is that what Irenaeus tells us around 180 CE or AD. He says that Simon Magus taught that he was now basically, you might say, the avatar of the Holy Spirit. But earlier than that, he had appeared on earth as the Son, S-O-N, and that in that role he had been crucified, but only appeared to suffer, but it was docetic. Right? Now, did that mean that he was a kind of phantom or hologram? Some docetists seem to believe that. Or did it just mean that he wasn't suffering, though you would expect he would? That he was sort of stoic and indifferent to the pain. Who knows? But he said that he had been crucified in Judea as the Son. And now he was back as the Spirit, and in ancient Israel, he had been the Father. Well, this is close enough to the time when Simon Magus supposedly lived, because there are ambiguities about that, even in the book of Acts, for instance, because though it makes Simon Magus a contemporary of Simon Peter, and Simon Peter a contemporary of Jesus, it also makes Paul a contemporary of Peter and a contemporary of Philip the deacon, who had 4 prophesying virgin daughters who were mentioned in chapter 20, I think. And who were they? Well, we don't know much about them, but Papias speaks of them as if they were contemporaries, and this guy's right near the middle of the 2nd century. And probably so was Luke, who wrote Acts. And that's not but a couple of decades before Irenaeus. So there's some temporal confusion here. And so there's another problem. You have identifications across time, and you have to think something has been garbled here. But that puts me in mind of something else from the book of Acts, where Paul, or Saul, as he's called at that point, and Barnabas go evangelizing on, oh boy, what is it? Is it Cyprus, one of the Mediterranean islands? And they're getting a hearing with the Roman governor, Sergius Paulus. And it's only after this that our buddy Saul starts using his stage name of Paul. Well, Saul, or Paul, and Barnabas meet with this guy, and he's very sympathetic to their message, but his court magician, named Elymas, is also, he's trying to discourage his boss. He's like Grima Wormtongue in the Lord of the Rings, right? He's the advisor to the king of is it Gondor? I think it is. Rohana, boy, it's been too long since I read it. But he says, don't listen to these guys, these representatives of Gandalf. No. And he's sort of like a Rasputin figure. In fact, that's the close parallel because Rasputin was supposed to be a miracle working magician and a saint. And you know the stories about him, how he lived in the 19th century in the last days of the Russian Empire, and he was sort of a nasty influence on the royal house. So they were in awe of his real or pretended powers. And when a conspiracy formed to get rid of him, they tried this, that, and the other thing to kill the guy, and nothing seemed to work. They stabbed him, they poisoned him, they tried to drown him, throwing him into the sea in a tied sack and so forth. Finally, he did die, supposedly. Well, that's the kind of guy that Elymas was. And this is interesting because you have a scenario here that appears to combine elements of Paul's conversion in the book of Acts, which is told 3 times, I think in chapters 9, 22, and 26, with slight variations, and the story of Peter facing off with Simon Magus in Samaria. And it's like musical identities, because Elymas, the magician, is an opponent of the Christian faith. And he gets rebuked and blinded, whereupon, of course, that prevents him from further troublemaking. He's temporarily blinded. Does that remind you of anybody like Saul of Tarsus? He's persecuting Christians, and then he's struck blind supernaturally, but Ananias of Damascus ministers to him and baptizes him, and suddenly he can see again, all of which is a pretty obvious metaphor for the blindness of sin and waking up to the truth of Christ, which he can now see. And Elymas is also not only an analog for Saul the persecutor, but for Simon Magus. And he's in some manuscripts almost named the same thing, because in some manuscripts, in the Western text, he is called Etomas or Etoimas. And if you look in Josephus, there is a similar figure, a magician who is part of the entourage of Felix and Festus, Bernice and Drusilla, Herod Agrippa the second, and so on. And this guy is a magician, and he's one of them. Paul runs into these people, as you know. And in some manuscripts of Josephus, he is called Simon, and in others, he's called Atomas. Well, all of these names kind of overlap, and it sort of implies that on some level, Etoimas, Etomas, Adamas, Elymas, and Simon and Saul and Paul are somehow all the same character. And boy, that is weird, but that's kind of my point. That would imply, again, that the stories have become garbled and elements of one have been transferred to the other. Therefore, though there seem to be odd and puzzling connections between the characters' names, Simon Magus, Paul, and so on, that may not reflect a historical connection between the two. But let's see, I wonder where to go next without getting so lost in the weeds. Let me suggest something else that, In Acts, in the Elamos business, it also says his name was meant as if were translated as Bar Jesus. That's not a ranch somewhere, but the son of somebody named Jesus. Well, that might mean nothing, right? I mean, there were plenty of guys named Joshua or Yeshua, and they had sons, and their sons, therefore, would have been, Stanley Bar Jesus, Bar Yeshua. But you got to wonder with all this name juggling if that doesn't have something to do with what Irenaeus says about Simon Magus having previously appeared among men as Jesus crucified in Judea. Could Bar Jesus, the son of Jesus in a metaphorical fashion, mean the subsequent reappearance of Jesus? That raises interesting questions. Did Simonians identify him with the second coming of Jesus? Did they believe in realized eschatology? I wouldn't rule it out, but that would seem, at least it gives a basis for the speculation that Simon was supposed to be a second coming of Jesus. Just as I'm sure you remember, Mark tells us that when the common people heard about Jesus and his healing miracles, and they knew John the Baptist, a character much like him, had recently been executed, and they said, "Is this John the Baptist raised from the dead, which is why he's now able to perform miracles?" Well, how many of them had ever gotten a good look at John the Baptist or Jesus, right? It didn't have TV, right? It was huge crowds. You ever see Monty Python's The Life of Brian, where Jesus is given the Sermon on the Mount? Of course, he doesn't have a PA system, so he's yelling at the top of his lungs, "How blessed are they of a gentle spirit!" And then the camera pans to the extreme edge of the crowd. And what did he say? He say, "Blessed what is it? The peacemakers, and blessed are the cheesemakers." And the sophisticated Sadducees says, "How we mustn't take it literally. Surely he meant to include all who work in dairy products." Well, he didn't say cheesemakers. He said peacemakers, right? But yeah, that's the challenge, right? That how many people could even see who Jesus was? And again, you can see that in the Monty Python scene. When the camera goes back, you see what a distance there would be, and what a dim, unfocused look you would have at Jesus. That comes into play here. How many people ever even saw Jesus up close, or Simon Magus, or John the Baptist? So it would have been easy to say, "I think this is that guy. He's somehow back because God has raised him from the dead," or whatever. Or there could be the problem of, wait a minute, Simon Magus is not old enough to be literally the son of Jesus. Well, depending on when you think he lived. Was he a second century or first century person? Because certain stories presuppose one or the other. But remember that Marcion apparently thought that when Jesus came to earth, he wasn't born as an infant and then grew up. He just appeared from the sky in Capernaum one day, already in the form of an adult. Well, they might have thought the same thing about his reappearance as Simon Magus. So that is not impossible. There is also the business of Jesus going into Egypt as an infant, taken there by Mary and Joseph because they're afraid of Herod's persecution. Of course, that's not historical. It's based on Josephus's version of the Nativity of Moses. But nonetheless, some people got a hold of that and said, "Oh, I wonder how long they stayed there. probably long enough for Jesus to have learned Egyptian magic. Yeah, that's how he knew how to do miracles. Well, that can't be right because in the story anyway, an angel tells Joseph, "Look, the coast is clear. You can go back home now because Herod's dead." But then Joseph hears that Herod's son Archelaus is on the throne, and he's a worse sob than Herod was. And so Joseph says to the angel, "I'm not so sure it's safe." And he's, "Well, okay, why don't you move up to Galilee and Nazareth? They'll never find you there if they're still looking." So that implies that it wasn't very long. But there's a story in the Pseudo Clementines, these Christian novels about Simon Magus and the apostles and John the Baptist, and fascinating stuff. It says there that John the Baptist had a sect of 30 men, and it was like based on astrotheology. They were using the lunar calendar, just like the temple staff, unlike the Essenes who used the solar calendar. But Simon was one of John's disciples, and he was designated to take over as John's heir. But when John died, Simon happened to be off in Egypt learning magic. And then when he came back and got the news that meet the new boss, same as the old boss, that a rival of his, Dositheus of Samaria, was now in charge of the sect. He tried to swallow his pride and be a good team player, but he eventually thought that Dositheus didn't really know what he was doing. And he challenged him for the leadership, and they had a miracle contest, and Simon won, and Dositheus left and started his own sect across the street, which lasted for a couple of centuries. Wait a minute now. He went to Egypt. Jesus went to Egypt. Does that mean they're the same guy? Well, that's a bit of a reach, it seems to me. A lot of people went to Egypt. And Josephus tells us that there was a guy he doesn't name, that he just calls the Egyptian, who was apparently a self-proclaimed prophet or Messiah. And he had come, apparently a Jew, but had been in Egypt and came back because he rounded up a bunch of the Sicarii, the zealot assassins. And I think he led them all to the Mount of Olives, where he said he was going to bring about the great deliverance and so on. But the Romans learned about it, and they were ready for him, and killed hundreds of his followers. But not him. He apparently somehow has slipped through their grasp. Well, some people say that this Egyptian prophet was Simon Magus. Obviously, it's all speculation. It's all connecting the dots. There's no way to be sure of this, but it sure is fascinating. And let's see. Some have said that maybe, based on the Holy Family having gone to Egypt, that the Egyptian prophet / Messiah was Jesus. Others, and I find this more plausible, is that he was Simon Magus, and that he was so interesting a character that the Roman procurator who defeated his troops said, "I kind of like this guy. Let's add him to our entourage," and that he became this Rasputin-like figure, Simon or Atomos. And who is it that Paul hangs around with while he's awaiting trial and keeps having these hearings that come to nothing before different Roman procurators, Festus and Felix? And Herod Agrippa II is in on it. He gives his testimony before Herod and so forth. Um, Josephus says that is Simon. And so now, and he's associated with this same group of people who are associated with Paul. He's under house arrest, but they seem to get along with him fine. They want to hear him. They think he's fascinating. Once again, I realize it's connecting the dots, but sometimes that's all you can do. Of course, you have to keep in mind how tentative and fragile such reconstructions are. But they're better than nothing, and they're pretty interesting. Okay, I'm going to have to not take this call. Yeah, okay. Now, I happen to think that even if this guy did think he was a second coming of Jesus, that it makes more sense to identify him with Paul. After all, he's associated with the same circle of people, including Roman procurators and Herodian kings and Drusilla and Bernice and so forth. And the thing that really clinches it for me is an observation back in the 19th century from one of F.C. Bauer's students, Gustav Volkmar. And Bauer thought, hey, you're right. I must have given him an A for that. And it's this, that there is an eerie similarity between the story of Simon Magus being baptized as a Christian and then going to Peter and saying, I see you can lay hands on people and they start to speak in tongues, etc. You know, I'm a miracle worker also. In fact, he had really captivated the people of Samaria by the stunts he did. And he said, I'll gladly pay you if you will show me how to do this. And Peter is stung, and he says, as J.B. Phillips translates it, to hell with you and your money. May your money perish with you, because you thought you could buy the gift of God with money. I can see right now you have neither lot nor part in this ministry. In fact, I see you bound in the shackles of torment or whatever in hell. And he said, oh, no, please, anything but that. Pray for me that it doesn't come to that. And then that's the end of that. Now, wait a second. Was he asking to have some role in the apostolic ministry, which Peter then says he cannot have? Well, yeah, because the whole point of that story where Philip manages to sway the Samaritans so that they leave the Simon fan club and are baptized as Christians, you notice an odd thing, that when they get converted and baptized by Philip, they pointedly do not receive the Holy Spirit. Now, why? I mean, elsewhere they do. Well, it's because of Luke's agenda, that he wants nothing to happen outside the purview of the Jerusalem apostles, right? So Paul has to be approved by them. Barnabas takes him under his wing and says, here's Paul, let me tell you a story. Oh, okay. And similarly, when the news about Philip converting the Samaritans gets back to Jerusalem, they say, okay, we got to really put a cap on this. Let's send Peter and John there, two of the great pillars of the church, right? And they go there and they assess the situation, and they do lay hands on the baptized, and they do receive the Spirit. So the point is to say that at least at that early stage of things, true apostolic ministry had to be restricted to the elders and apostles in Jerusalem. And that's what Simon Magus wants. And he's willing to pay for it. And they say, nothing doing. I say there's an eerie parallel between that and what Paul says in Galatians when he's trying to show where his alliance with the Jerusalem pillars, Cephas, James, and John, went off the tracks. He said, now I went there with Titus and Barnabas to explain to them the terms in which we preach the gospel to Gentiles. They preach to Jews. But we're, Greek-speaking Jews, and we're preaching to Jews and Gentiles. And we'd like their support. We'd like their authentication. So we're going to go there and take the risk of explaining it, running it by them, and seeing if we do agree. What he would have done had they said, oh, no, you got this all wrong. Well, we don't know. But he says, luckily, it was fine with them. They gave us the right hand of fellowship and said, okay, from now on, Peter will go to evangelize the circumcision, fellow Jews, but you can go out among the wider Gentile world, and they don't have to keep the whole law, just a few commands so that they don't needlessly offend Jews. And he's one other thing though, Paul. Our approval is conditional on your raising funds for us, the struggling Jerusalem commune. You know what Margaret Thatcher said about that kind of arrangement. The problem with socialism is soon you run out of other people's money. They pooled everything they had, and it's going to happen. Well, it did, and so they're getting lean and hungry. And so, Paul, we would like you to take up collections among your, bigger number of churches all over the place and send it to us, kind of tribute money, you might say. And Paul says, I was only too happy to agree. And then in Romans, and it's hinted in Acts also, when he does take up the collection in Macedonia and in Achaia and so forth, and brings the money to James in Jerusalem, it backfires because all the Jerusalem Jewish Christians are hostile to him because they hear that he is telling Jews among the Hellenistic diaspora, don't bother circumcising your kids anymore. Don't keep the Torah. I don't. And that's not quite true, right? But that's what they think. And they say, why don't you use that money to pay for the ritual haircuts of these guys one of our members who are just completing a Nazirite vow, right? Because during the vow, you just let your hair grow for as long as you've signed on for the vow. And when it's over, you get a haircut. But apparently that cost a lot. And so if everybody sees you doing that, they'll say, hey, Paul must be an observant Jew after all. I guess we misjudged him. But no, it didn't work that way. They saw him hanging around with Titus, a Gentile, and said, this SOB is corrupting true Judaism. And he brought this Gentile goyim into the temple. Well, actually, he didn't. But if you did that, and they went beyond the court of the Gentiles, there was a death penalty. So this erupts in a riot, and that causes Paul to be, public enemy number one among the Jews and Jewish Christians. Well, Volkmar said, I think these are two versions of the same events. That when Simon Magus is offering a bribe, to put it invidiously, to put it pejoratively, to Peter Let me join the Apostolic Club. And he gets refused. Well, what are you talking about? Get the hell out of here. That's like the Paul agreeing to pay tribute money to the Jerusalem pillars, which they then wind up rejecting. I have to say, I think that's correct. It just works out too well. And that means Simon and Paul are the same guy. So now, it was he actually the historical Jesus? To me, that's pushing it a little too far, because the only real Jesus connection is that Simon seems to be saying that in a recent previous life he had appeared as Jesus. That's not exactly a historical claim, right? I mean, even if that's what he believed, would you say that's a historical judgment? I don't think I would. This, I think if you say that it looks like Simon Magus and Paul were two different names for the same guy, that is a historical judgment. It might be a mistake, right? It's just a theory, and all historical reconstructions are tentative and provisional. But it seems to me there is a pattern to the evidence that does make it look like Simon Magus and Paul were the same guy, which would certainly explain why the earliest Paulinists we actually have evidence for in the early church were the Marcionites, Encratites, and Gnostics. And they said, "Yeah, oh yeah, Paul, he was the one, the fountainhead of our belief. In fact, Valentinus, the greatest of the Gnostics, he claimed to have been taught by Theodas, who in turn was a disciple of Paul." And sure enough, the first commentaries on the Pauline epistles were written by Gnostics and Marcionites. And on the other hand, the Catholics always said, you know who started Gnosticism? That rat? Well, that was Simon Magus. Could it be both of them were right because they're talking about the same guy? I think so. Again, who knows? There's no way to verify it unless you've got a time machine you can loan me. But it is very fascinating stuff, and there's plenty of interesting speculation to chew on. Okay. Let's go up here to look at the comments. Z Stallone, does this mean the historical Jesus is the historical Paul? Well, I don't think so, but Lena Einhorn does. She thinks that Paul, Jesus, and the Egyptian of Josephus are all the same guy. And her argument is quite interesting. I don't remember it well enough to detail it here, but she's done a couple of books where she makes a surprising argument for that. Then Z says, how does Jesus being Simon Magus play into the Simon being the Egyptian? I think I've already tried to explain that. Does this mean Jesus learned faith healing and magic in Egypt? I don't think so, because the thing in Matthew is no real evidence. It's just a kind of fanciful retelling of Josephus's version of the Moses nativity. So there's no real reason to believe that happened. But Simon being the Egyptian is also very speculative, but at least there is a couple of pieces of evidence you can connect hypothetically. Okay. Z Stallone, how do the India Jesus stories affect the Simon hypothesis? I don't think that is anything but a modern hoax that goes back to Russian secret agent and spy who was also a journalist named Nicholas Natovich. I hope I'm saying that right. He claimed to have broken his leg when he was in Tibet, and he found refuge in a Tibetan lamasery there. And it was going to take a while for him to recuperate and wait till the weather tamed, and the monks there allowed him the use of their library, and apparently he knew these Oriental languages like Tibetan, and he took advantage of the opportunity. And he said one book especially really interested him, a scroll called The Life of Saint Isa, the best of the sons of men, and that this detailed what Jesus was doing during the hidden years, right? What was Jesus doing before he was baptized by John the Baptist? Well, must have been doing something important. So they said maybe he was traveling in the Far East and learning about Buddhism and Hinduism and Jainism and stuff like that. Yeah, I bet he was. But there's Max Muller soon exposed this as a hoax, and then Natovich began to change the story to try to accommodate to that. But it's still being published and republished and believed by the uninformed. But there's no evidence that Jesus ever went to Egypt, or to India, I should say. Not that it would have been impossible, right? There are legends of Thomas going to Egypt to preach. Well, they had travel in those days. It wasn't like going from one star system to another, light years away. They had commerce. Alexander the Great went to India. So did Apollonius of Tyana. I mean, it could have happened, but there's just no reason to think it did. Do the infancy gospels fit into this theory about Jesus being Simon? I don't see how. In fact, the infancy gospels are not really friendly to the idea that Jesus had to learn anything, right? When they do take him to a tutor to be taught the alphabet, for instance, he already knows it, and the Kabbalistic significance of all the letters, and he rebukes the teachers who don't know as much as he does, and so forth. He even kills one of them. That idea doesn't really seem to fit too well. If Simon claimed to be Jesus crucified in a past life, does that mean Joshua, son of Nun, could have been what Simon was referring to? Well, I don't think so, because his point was he had suffered, though with no harm done, on the cross in Judea recently. And of course, nobody ever said that about the Old Testament Joshua. Graham Pong, who was with me and a couple of others on Eon Byte discussing Gnostic movies the other night. Graham says there's a lot of overlap amongst all these characters: Jesus, Simon Magus, Simon Peter, Paul and Saul of Tarsus, Apollonius of Tyana, and Flavius Josephus. Am I missing any characters? I think that's pretty much the whole roundup. There's some borrowing of Pythagoras traditions that sneak into the Gospels. But yeah, I think you've got, they're all cut from the same cloth. Oops, I'm sorry. Ironclad Bible study says, what is your take on John 8:44? I think I know what that is. Who is their father? John 8:44. Where to put those darn glasses? Well, I'm thinking I know what that is. Yeah, here we are. Let's start with 8:39. They answered him, Abraham. Well, I'm sorry. Let's start with 37. I know that you are descendants of Abraham, yet you seek to kill me because my word finds no place in you. I speak of what I've seen with my father, and you do what you have heard from your father. They answered him, Abraham is our father. Jesus said to them, if you were Abraham's children, you would do what Abraham did. But now you seek to kill me, a man who has told you the truth which I heard from God. This is not what Abraham did. You do what your father did. They said to him, we were not born of fornication. We have one Father, even God. Jesus said to them, if God were your Father, you would love me, for I proceeded and came forth from God. I came not of my own accord, but he sent me. Why do you not understand what I say? It is because you cannot bear to hear my word. You are of your father, the devil, and your will is to do your father's desires. He was a murderer from the beginning, and so on. Bultmann claimed that the Greek grammar does not allow for that translation, that the genitive involved must be translated, you are of, or you belong to, the father of the devil. Now, David Litwa says, well, it's ambiguous. It could mean either one. Well, I don't know my Greek nearly as well as these guys do. So I don't know. But there was a Gnostic character known as the father of the devil. Had something to do with a demiurge or whatever. And also it appears in Islamic lore and in East European legend. If they are of the father of the devil, that means they're on a par with Satan and are like Satan. So, what's the difference? But kind of nasty stuff, right? Um, Slick Trick says Paul was a Docetist. Yeah, I kind of suspect that too. He came in the likeness of sinful flesh. He assumed the form of a servant. Slick Trick says Jesus was Judas. Well, I'm not touching that one with a 10-foot Ukrainian. Um, mm, Graham Pong says, I'm currently going with the many Jesuses, one Christ theory. There's the divine Christ consciousness, the archetype of kenosis, the self emptying, which is topped by various human beings who are the Jesuses. Interesting. And Graham's, no, I'm Slick Trick. Well, let's see here. Graham says our Paul is a literary character of the second, third, and fourth century. Who the human beings were that Paul was based upon is an open question. Some people think he was possibly Proteus, Peregrinus the Cynic. Some think he was Apollonius of Tyana. And then Graham says, one person I pencil in as Paul is General Gaius Suetonius Paulinus. Uh, uh, well, I think that's about all I'm going to get done tonight. And I, of course, cannot come up with a definitive conclusion of what relation there was, if any, between Jesus and Simon, even literarily, but it sure is intriguing and well worth shooting the breeze over. So I'll see you tomorrow at 6 again for another exciting episode. I would like to express great thanks to Crestus, who gave a very generous contribution to the Old Geek today, and very helpful in a bit of a pinch, as I mentioned, and I appreciate your support.